Power looks impressive from a distance. The tailored suit, the security detail, the driver waiting outside with the engine running. When a millionaire CEO walks into a room, people notice. Conversations shift. Staff move faster. Phones come out quietly to snap photos. On the surface, it feels like control, influence, authority that bends the room in one direction. But power without respect is something else entirely. That night, the CEO arrived at the restaurant with the confidence of a man who believed the world had already agreed to his terms. He wasn't just there for dinner. He was there to finalize a $200 million partnership with investors who had flown in that morning. The kind of deal that would double his company's valuation overnight. The kind that would make headlines before sunrise. He shook hands firmly, smiled for exactly the right amount of time, ordered the most expensive bottle on the menu without glancing at the price. Everything about him signaled success. He had built his empire from nothing, or at least that's the story repeated in interviews. He believed that story, maybe too much. Then the waitress approached the table. She was calm, professional, and precise. She repeated orders carefully to avoid mistakes. When she asked a simple clarification about one of his requests, he didn't see a professional doing her job. He saw an interruption. He sighed loudly, rolled his eyes, and in a voice just sharp enough to cut through the table's polite conversation, he called her stupid. The word hung in the air longer than anyone expected. Power can make people comfortable. Respect keeps them grounded. Without respect, power becomes a performance fueled by ego. And ego is fragile. It reacts quickly. It lashes out. It demands control even in moments that don't require it. The CEO wasn't reacting to incompetence. He was reacting to being questioned, even politely. For someone used to having assistants anticipate his thoughts before he spoke them, being asked to clarify felt like a challenge. And instead of responding with patience, he responded with dominance. But here's the truth about dominance. It's loud. Respect is quiet. The waitress didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply nodded, corrected the order, and walked away. The rest of the table shifted uncomfortably. A few forced laughs. Someone cleared their throat. The investors exchanged quick glances they thought went unnoticed. In that moment, the CEO believed he had reinforced his authority. He thought he had shown who was in charge. That's the illusion of unchecked power. It convinces you that small humiliations don't matter, that the people beneath you in status don't carry weight. What he failed to see was that leadership isn't measured by how you treat people who need you. It's measured by how you treat people who don't. The waitress needed the job. She needed the tips. On paper, she had no leverage. No influence over corporate negotiations or venture capital. But respect is not about leverage. It's about character. The investors weren't just evaluating profit margins and growth projections. They were evaluating the man they were about to tie their reputation to. A $200 million deal isn't just about numbers. It's about trust, stability, judgment under pressure. And if someone loses their composure over a minor inconvenience in a restaurant, what happens during a market crash, during a lawsuit, during a public relations crisis? Power without respect doesn't just embarrass others. It exposes weakness. The CEO believed his wealth insulated him from consequences. He believed money spoke louder than manners. For years, that belief had probably worked in his favor. People tolerated him because they needed access. Employees stayed quiet because they needed paychecks. Associates overlooked his tone because the returns were strong. But power built without respect is unstable. It relies on silence, not loyalty. Fear, not admiration. Compliance, not trust. In rooms filled with real decision-makers, that difference matters. The investors watched how he treated someone who couldn't advance his agenda, someone who had nothing to offer him except service. And in that brief exchange, they saw something financial statements could never reveal. They saw how he handled vulnerability when it wasn't his own. They saw how quickly he devalued someone based on position. They saw how comfortable he was diminishing another human being to protect his ego. Power can open doors. It can reserve tables. It can command attention. But without respect, it begins to erode the very foundation it stands on. Because the same mouth that dismisses a waitress can dismiss a partner. The same temper that flares at a simple question can flare in a boardroom. And the same ego that demands control in small moments will eventually miscalculate in larger ones. It wasn't the volume of his voice that shocked the room. It was how easily the word came out. Stupid, not muttered under his breath, not said in frustration after a major mistake. It slipped out casually, almost comfortably, like it belonged there. Like he had said it before. That's what exposed him. Anyone can pretend to be polished when the stakes are high. In meetings, on stage, in interviews, leaders rehearse their composure. They know when to smile, when to nod, when to say the right thing. But character shows up in the unscripted seconds. In the small interactions no one thinks will matter. The waitress had simply asked him to repeat part of his order. The restaurant was loud. Glasses clinked. Conversations overlapped. She leaned in slightly and said, "I'm sorry. Could you clarify which side you'd prefer with that?" It was a routine question, one she probably asked dozens of times a night. But to him, it felt like inconvenience. He didn't pause to consider the environment. Didn't think about how difficult it is to balance multiple tables while staying attentive. He saw only delay. And instead of answering calmly, he let irritation lead. "Are you stupid? I just said it." The investors heard it. The assistant seated near the end of the table heard it. The couple dining 2 tables overheard it. Even the bartender looked up. It wasn't just an insult. It was a reflex. And reflexes reveal what rehearsed speeches hide. For years, this CEO had cultivated a public image. Magazine covers described him as visionary. Interviews praised his discipline. Employees called him demanding but brilliant. He spoke often about grit, excellence, and high standards. He framed himself as someone who expected the best because he gave his best. But expectations and contempt are not the same thing. High standards challenge people to rise. Contempt pushes them down. When he called her stupid, he wasn't correcting performance. He was asserting superiority. It wasn't about the side dish. It was about control, about reminding someone of their place. The waitress didn't argue. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't match his tone. She simply apologized, even though she had done nothing wrong, and repeated the order back to him carefully. Her restraint made his reaction stand out even more, because now there was contrast. Composure beside arrogance. Professionalism beside ego. The investors at the table had spent months reviewing spreadsheets, projections, and risk assessments. They knew his company's growth curve. They knew the market potential. But numbers don't reveal temperament. Temperament shows itself in moments like this. A careless word can act like a spotlight. It shines on patterns people try to hide. The way he said it suggested familiarity, as if speaking down to someone came naturally, as if impatience was his default setting. No one builds a $200 million company without intelligence. That wasn't in question. What was in question was judgment. Because leaders are always being evaluated, even when they think they aren't. The restaurant wasn't a boardroom, but it might as well have been. Every interaction was data. Every reaction was information. Investors don't just buy into products. They buy into people. And people come with habits. If he could humiliate a waitress in public, how would he treat a junior executive behind closed doors? If he dismissed a simple question with an insult, how would he handle disagreement from a partner? Would he listen? Or would he belittle? Trust isn't built on intelligence alone. It's built on emotional control. And in that brief exchange, he showed a lack of it. The word stupid did more than offend. It signaled impatience with imperfection. It suggested a belief that certain roles deserved less dignity. It revealed how he responded when someone disrupted his sense of efficiency. Arrogance rarely announces itself loudly. It leaks out in small, sharp comments. In sighs. In eye rolls. In tones that suggest someone else is beneath consideration. What made the moment powerful wasn't just the insult. It was the setting. A high-stakes dinner. A deal about to close. A room filled with people assessing risk. He thought he was demonstrating authority. What he demonstrated was fragility. Because secure leaders don't need to belittle others to feel in control. They answer questions. They clarify. They move on. The investors leaned back slightly after it happened. Subtle shifts. A change in energy. Conversation resumed, but something had adjusted. They weren't just hearing his pitch anymore. They were replaying that word. Stupid. It echoed louder than his financial projections. And in that echo, his true character became harder to ignore. What he didn't notice that night wasn't the tension at the table. It wasn't the slight pause after he spoke. It was the silence from the people who mattered most. The silent witnesses. They didn't confront him. They didn't correct him. They didn't lecture him about respect or professionalism. They simply watched. Across the table sat the lead investor, a man known for being measured and observant. He rarely spoke first in negotiations. He preferred to listen, to study patterns, to see how people behaved when they thought no one important was paying attention. He had built his own reputation not just on smart investments, but on reading character accurately. Next to him sat his partner, flipping a pen slowly between her fingers. She had been quiet most of the evening, letting the CEO dominate the conversation. She asked sharp questions earlier about long-term scalability and leadership structure. Questions he answered confidently, almost rehearsed. But when the waitress was insulted, she didn't look at her plate. She looked directly at him. Not with outrage, with calculation. Further down the table, an associate pretended to check his phone. But his eyes had lifted the second the word left the CEO's mouth. He wasn't checking messages. He was observing reactions. Investors rarely rely on a single impression. They gather data from everywhere, including moments that seem unrelated to business. Even beyond the table, there were witnesses. The restaurant manager had heard it. So had the couple celebrating an anniversary nearby. A young intern from the investment firm, seated at the end of the table, had stiffened in his chair. He had admired the CEO before that night, followed his interviews, quoted him once in a college presentation. Now he was seeing a version that never made it to podcasts. The CEO continued speaking after the incident, unaware that the tone of the room had shifted. He talked about market dominance, expansion into new territories, projected revenue increases over the next 5 years. His voice was steady, confident. He believed the evening was going according to plan. But the silent witnesses were no longer just listening to his words. They were comparing them to his behavior. It's easy to talk about culture and leadership when you're presenting slides. It's harder to live those values when a server asks you to repeat yourself. The lead investor didn't interrupt him. He didn't reference the incident directly. Instead, he asked a new question. How do you handle internal conflict within your executive team? It sounded routine, almost unrelated. The CEO answered quickly. He spoke about accountability, about expecting excellence, about not tolerating incompetence. He used phrases like high-performance environment and zero room for error. But now those phrases carried different weight. The silent witnesses connected the dots. If a simple request for clarification triggered irritation, what would a missed quarterly target trigger? If he equated inconvenience with stupidity, how would he respond to disagreement? Silence can be more powerful than confrontation. When people argue back, you get the chance to defend yourself, to explain, to soften the damage. But when they simply observe, you don't even realize you're being evaluated. The waitress returned to refill glasses later in the evening. She remained composed, professional. She addressed everyone at the table equally, including him. She didn't shrink. She didn't retaliate. Her steadiness only made his earlier reaction seem more unnecessary. The investors noticed that too. Leadership is often revealed in how someone treats those who cannot retaliate. And the silent witnesses understood that power dynamics don't disappear just because a deal is on the table. In fact, high-stakes moments amplify them. The CEO believed he was the most powerful person in the room. Financially, he might have been. But power during negotiations is shared. And respect influences how that power is distributed. As dessert menus were placed down, the conversation slowed. The energy felt different. Not hostile, just cooler, more cautious. The easy momentum from earlier had faded. The lead investor leaned back in his chair and studied the CEO as he spoke. Not interrupting, not nodding as enthusiastically as before, just watching. Silent witnesses don't forget quickly. They file moments away. They revisit them later when decisions need to be made. They ask themselves quiet questions. Is this someone we can trust under pressure? Is this someone who elevates people or diminishes them? Is this someone whose judgment aligns with our values? The CEO mistook their silence for agreement. He thought the absence of confrontation meant the incident was insignificant. But in rooms where millions of dollars are discussed, nothing is insignificant. Every gesture is noted. Every tone is weighed. And while he continued outlining his vision for growth, the silent witnesses were reaching their own conclusions, piece by piece, without saying a word. The shift didn't happen with a loud announcement. There was no dramatic outburst. No one stood up and slammed a hand on the table. The $200 million deal didn't collapse in flames. It unraveled quietly. At first, everything seemed intact. The CEO continued speaking with the same confidence he had walked in with. He referenced market trends, highlighted competitive advantages, and projected aggressive expansion over the next 3 quarters. He spoke like a man already celebrating. In his mind, the dinner was a formality. The numbers were strong. The timing was right. The investors had shown clear interest for weeks. But momentum is fragile. When the lead investor set his glass down and folded his hands on the table, the room grew still in a subtle way. Not tense, just focused. The kind of focus that signals a decision forming. "I think we need to revisit something," the investor said calmly. The CEO smiled, assuming it was about valuation structure or timeline adjustments. He was ready to negotiate percentages. He had rehearsed those conversations. Instead, the investor asked, "How do you define leadership in your company?" It was a broad question, one that could have been answered with polished statements about integrity and accountability. And that's exactly what the CEO delivered. He spoke about excellence, about demanding the best from his team, about pushing people beyond their limits to achieve breakthrough results. The investor listened without interrupting. Then he nodded slightly and said, "Leadership is also about how you treat people when there's nothing to gain from them." The sentence landed softly, but it carried weight. The CEO's smile tightened. For a second, confusion flickered across his face. Then understanding. He realized the earlier comment hadn't evaporated into the background like he assumed. It had stayed. The partner seated next to the lead investor leaned forward. "We invest in companies," she said. "But more importantly, we invest in leaders. Culture starts at the top." The CEO attempted to brush it aside. He chuckled lightly and said something about high-pressure environments and expecting sharpness from everyone. He implied that standards sometimes require bluntness. He framed the insult as intensity. But intensity without control doesn't inspire confidence. The associate at the end of the table spoke for the first time that evening. "If a server asking for clarification leads to that reaction," he said carefully, "it raises questions about how conflict is handled internally." There it was. Not anger. Not moral outrage. Risk assessment. Investors are trained to look for patterns that signal future problems. A temper today can become a lawsuit tomorrow. Disrespect in a restaurant can become reputational damage in a public scandal. In a world where brand image can swing stock prices overnight, temperament is financial risk. The CEO shifted in his seat. He began explaining, saying it was taken out of context, saying he was focused on the discussion, saying the environment was distracting. Each explanation sounded thinner than the last. The energy at the table had changed completely now. Earlier, there had been warmth, shared laughter, a sense of collaboration. Now the conversation felt procedural, analytical, distant. The lead investor didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply said, "We have to consider alignment. Our partners reflect our values." Silence followed, the kind that makes every small sound feel amplified. Silverware against porcelain. A chair adjusting slightly. The hum of conversation from other tables. The CEO realized the ground beneath him was shifting. He pivoted back to numbers. Growth curves. Market dominance. Future acquisitions. He spoke faster, as if data could erase doubt. But once doubt enters the room, it doesn't leave easily. The partner closed her folder slowly. "We're going to pause on finalizing this," she said. "We need to reassess." The word pause sounded temporary. But in high-stakes finance, pause often means no. The CEO's posture stiffened. "Reassess what exactly?" he asked, the edge returning to his voice. "Leadership risk," the lead investor replied. 2 words. Clean. Direct. A $200 million deal doesn't disappear because of a single sentence in isolation. It disappears because that sentence reveals something larger, something structural, something that numbers can't offset. The waitress passed by again, carrying a tray for another table. She didn't look toward them. She didn't know the specifics of what was happening. But the consequences of that earlier moment were unfolding in real time. The CEO had walked into the restaurant believing he controlled the narrative, believing success was already secured. But influence is conditional. Respect is part of the equation. And when respect is questioned, so is stability. The investors stood to leave shortly after. Handshakes were shorter. Smiles were restrained. Promises to stay in touch replaced the earlier language of partnership. By the time the CEO stepped outside into the night air, the deal that had felt guaranteed just hours before was no longer his to claim. There's a quiet test that happens every day, and most people don't realize they're taking it. It doesn't happen on stage. It doesn't happen during presentations or press interviews. It happens in ordinary places: elevators, parking garages, restaurants, hallways. It shows up in the way someone speaks to a receptionist, a driver, a server, a janitor. The people many label as the least important are often the clearest mirrors of who you are. That night at the restaurant, the waitress had no visible influence over contracts or capital. She didn't sit at the negotiation table. She wasn't reviewing financial models. She wasn't transferring funds. In a strict hierarchy of power, she ranked at the bottom of the room. And that's exactly why the moment mattered. When someone holds status, wealth, or authority, there's a natural temptation to adjust behavior upward. Politeness becomes strategic. Smiles become calculated. Respect is extended because there's something to gain or lose. But when interacting with someone who seems to have no leverage, the mask often slips. The CEO had been charming to the investors. Attentive, engaging. He maintained eye contact. He listened when they spoke. He complimented their past ventures. He knew how to perform respect when it served him. But when the waitress approached, the performance ended. He didn't see her as part of the room's significance. He saw her as background, a service function, a minor interruption between important conversations. And in that perception, he revealed something deeper than impatience. He revealed his hierarchy of human value. For him, importance seemed tied to power, to influence, to what someone could provide in return. The waitress, in his mind, provided a meal, not opportunity, not capital, not advantage. So his tone changed. What many fail to understand is that how you treat someone with less visible power says more about you than how you treat someone with more. Respect that flows upward can be strategy. Respect that flows downward is character. The investors understood this instinctively. They weren't just evaluating quarterly returns. They were evaluating leadership philosophy, because culture inside a company mirrors the behavior at the top. If a CEO believes certain roles are beneath courtesy, that belief filters down. Executives mirror it. Managers adopt it. Employees internalize it. Over time, it shapes how teams communicate, how problems are handled, how mistakes are addressed. Disrespect doesn't stay isolated. It spreads quietly. In high-performing organizations, every role matters. Not because of sentiment, but because of function. A receptionist controls first impressions. A customer service agent protects brand reputation. A junior analyst catches errors that could cost millions. Dismissing people based on title blinds a leader to their impact. The waitress that night executed her role with precision. She managed multiple tables without confusion. She maintained composure under pressure. She ensured the evening ran smoothly. In a different context, those same traits would be praised as operational excellence. But because her title didn't command status, her competence was overlooked. The irony is that true leadership recognizes value in all positions, not in a superficial way, not through rehearsed statements about equality, but through consistent behavior. The CEO likely saw himself as a builder of opportunity, a creator of jobs, a driver of economic growth, and perhaps he was. But the way he handled that brief interaction suggested that dignity, in his mind, was conditional. Conditional on rank. Conditional on influence. The investors weren't looking for perfection. They weren't expecting saintly behavior. They were looking for signals. signals of stability, signals of judgment, signals of emotional intelligence. And in the way he treated someone he believed didn't matter, he sent a clear signal. Because leadership isn't tested when you're surrounded by peers. It's tested when you're interacting with people who can't threaten your position. The waitress couldn't affect his stock price. She couldn't challenge his authority in a board meeting. She couldn't block a merger. But she could reveal who he was when no immediate consequence seemed attached. In business, reputation compounds. So does behavior. Investors know that today's small humiliation can become tomorrow's public controversy. A pattern of dismissiveness can turn into employee turnover. Arrogance can morph into blind spots that cost more than money. The CEO may have believed the waitress was insignificant in the larger scheme of his success. But in that moment, she became the measure of it. Because the true weight of a person's character isn't seen in how they navigate power. It's seen in how they handle those who appear to have none. By the time the investors left the restaurant, the lesson had already formed. Not in a dramatic speech, not in a public confrontation. It settled in through observation. Every leader, no matter how successful, carries blind spots. The danger isn't having them. The danger is refusing to see them. The CEO walked into that dinner believing leadership was about vision, strategy, and dominance. He believed results justified tone. That intensity proved commitment. That sharpness signaled strength. But strength without restraint is volatility. The investors weren't shaken by his ambition. They weren't intimidated by his confidence. They were unsettled by his lack of control in a moment that required almost none. Leadership isn't tested when everything goes smoothly. It's tested in interruptions, in minor inconveniences, in moments where ego has an opportunity to step forward. When the waitress asked for clarification, it wasn't a crisis. It wasn't a threat to the deal. It wasn't even a disruption. It was a routine part of service. Yet his reaction was disproportionate. And disproportion signals instability. The lesson every leader needs to learn isn't complicated. It's uncomfortable. Emotional discipline is not optional at the top. You can be brilliant and still lose trust. You can be innovative and still lose respect. You can build something massive and still watch it weaken because of how you handle small moments. The investors didn't withdraw because of morality alone. They withdrew because temperament affects outcomes. A leader who humiliates casually may alienate talent. A leader who reacts impulsively may escalate conflict. A leader who equates authority with superiority may stop listening. And the moment a leader stops listening, decline begins quietly. Many executives focus on scaling operations, expanding markets, and optimizing performance. Few focus with equal intensity on mastering their reactions. But reactions compound just like revenue. One careless outburst becomes a story. Multiple outbursts become a reputation. Reputation influences opportunity. The CEO likely believed that his track record insulated him. That past wins guaranteed future trust. But trust is not stored like capital. It is evaluated continuously, reassessed with every interaction. In high-stakes environments, investors look beyond spreadsheets. They look at posture, tone, patience. They observe how a leader treats assistants, wait staff, junior employees. Because those patterns predict boardroom behavior more accurately than mission statements. The lesson is not about perfection. It's about awareness. A leader who recognizes a mistake quickly, takes responsibility, and corrects course can maintain credibility. A leader who rationalizes disrespect as passion erodes it. When the CEO tried to justify his comment as intensity, he missed the point. Intensity directed at problems can build companies. Intensity directed at people destroys culture. Every organization reflects its leadership. If the person at the top communicates through intimidation, fear trickles down. If the person at the top models composure, stability follows. Teams mirror what they experience. The $200 million deal was not just an investment in a product. It was an investment in stewardship. Investors were asking themselves whether this was someone who could manage growth without self-sabotage. Because growth amplifies flaws. If impatience shows up at a dinner table, it will show up during negotiations. If disrespect appears in small hierarchies, it will appear in larger ones. Scaling a company without scaling emotional maturity creates fractures. The lesson every leader needs to learn before it's too late is simple but demanding. Your title does not exempt you from basic decency. Your net worth does not excuse poor judgment. Your success does not replace self-control. Power magnifies behavior. It doesn't conceal it. In quiet rooms, decisions are made based on patterns others notice long before you do. And once those patterns shape perception, opportunities shift. Leadership is not just about commanding attention. It's about managing yourself when attention isn't the goal. Because in the end, the smallest moments often reveal the largest truths about who should be trusted with something big.